Things like thought leadership, brand awareness, brand affinity, brand lift. These are the kind of things that podcasting does incredibly well.
So I know you are the master of all things podcasts.
I ended up getting fired because I lost the voiceover recordings of a Domestos advert. Didn't really know what I was going to do next.
He's produced nearly 10,000 episodes, pulled in over 15 million downloads, and worked with My First Million's Sam Parr on the launch of his latest show.
The metric we should track is not the number of people that are downloading this podcast or clicking play, it's the consumption rate of that podcast. So how many people are completing episodes? What percentage of our episodes are people listening to?
Today's guest is Harry Morton, founder of one of the most respected podcast production studios on the planet. He's helped build and grow shows for major brands like Pepsi, Morgan Stanley, and Booking.com.
So Boston Consulting Group, Bain, Stanford Graduate School of Business, Booking.com, Adobe, people like this will come to us and say they want a podcast, and our job initially is to help them come up with the concept for the show.
And in today's episode, we unpack how to launch, grow, and scale a podcast in 2025, even in a crowded market.
Most of the agencies that you'll find out there are kind of really focused on interview-based podcasting, which there's nothing wrong with, but we're really interested in like storytelling and narrative and making like documentary style shows, and that was what he was going for.
The playbook his business uses to build chart-topping shows for founders and brands, and why most podcasts fail, and the levers that actually move the needle and help you avoid this happen.
Take a step back. Would you listen to this show if it wasn't your own? You know, an uninteresting show, paying people to listen to it and click on it is not going to make them like it anymore.
So if you want to build a podcast that people actually listen to and turn it into a real growth engine for your business, then this is the episode for you. Harry, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here.
Cool. Well, look, I'm just going to get straight into it. So I know you are the master of all things podcasts, and I want to start off with your background because you've been in the game for nearly 10 years now. Can you just talk to kind of that experience of getting started in the space? And yeah.
So my background is in music. I went to university to study music and production. So kind of the nerd end of the music spectrum. And I did all of that, and I went from university straight into a studio in London doing post production for ad campaigns here in the UK. So things like, you know, Colgate toothpaste and HSBC and their sort of TV spots, we would be producing the audio for that. I was a very low level, engineer there. And to be honest, I really didn't enjoy it. We were working with big sort of global agencies, which was really interesting. It was a great experience. And I learned a lot, but one of the things that I learned was that I really hated that environment, didn't enjoy it at all. And I ended up getting fired because I lost the voiceover recordings of a Domestos advert. My job was to sort of enter, track recording sessions between studios so that audio files wouldn't be lost. And I failed in doing that one day and lost some important recordings, and I was promptly let go. So that was the sort of end of my initial foray into sort of the audio and agency world, and I went from there sort of rather crestfallen but also massively relieved that I didn't have to work there anymore. Didn't really know what I was going to do next. So it was from there that I went into sales and marketing, worked a few sales jobs, first here in London, then overseas, and lived in Australia for 2.5 years, doing sales out there. And it was sort of during that period where, I'd always known since I was very young, I wanted to own my own business, but it was sort of during that period that I really started to think, okay, what could I do? And I spent all of my time listening to podcasts to educate myself on that. And sort of, I guess you could say that the penny sort of slowly dropped that actually maybe this was an industry. I was using it to educate myself. I was getting a huge amount of value from podcasting. I had the sort of audio background, and now I'd spent some time doing sales. Maybe there was something I could do here. And I sort of spent some time looking around. I was really inspired by Gimlet Media at the time, who were doing the startup podcast, and kind of learning all about that, and a few other agencies. And I sort of looked around. I thought, well, actually, there's a lot of agencies here that aren't doing amazing work, and I feel like there's something maybe we can do differently. And so I set up in 2015-16 in my underpants in my bedroom in Peckham in London, and built it up slowly from there. And so here we are 9 years later with 35 people and working with huge brands all over the world. It's been an interesting journey.
For sure. Let's kind of dig into that then, and focusing specifically on you guys. What do you guys like do today for brands on the B2B side, and how has that evolved, in the past 10 years?
Yeah, so what we do is particularly large sort of enterprise companies. So Boston Consulting Group, Bain, Stanford Graduate School of Business, Booking.com, Adobe, people like this will come to us and say that they want a podcast. And our job initially is to help them come up with the concept for the show. So what is the strategy around the content, and how are we going to make this stand apart and be interesting? Then we're going to make the show, produce it. We handle the production, the writing, the scripting, the editing, and all that sort of stuff. And then once the show is out, we can help with sort of the distribution and promotion of that content as well. So it's sort of really an end-to-end, I suppose, service. And the way that's evolved is that, you know, my background is in audio, as I say. So when I first started, really what I was doing was just editing audio. I was offering existing podcasters, always with brands. Like the intention was from the beginning was very much to work with companies, but working with them to help them edit their interviews, publish their episodes and all that sort of stuff. And it's kind of the one of the first iterations I went through, or first, you know, pivot. I'm not sure pivot is quite the right word, but evolutions, I should say, of the business was to kind of really make a concerted effort to go up market. And so really looking for those enterprise kind of customers. And then from there, once we got in with the enterprise, it was very clear that there was a whole lot more that we could offer them from the early stages of, as I say, sort of concept development and strategy through to the sort of distribution and promotion. And so it was, the first step was kind of going into the enterprise. And then the next step was sort of fanning out from there and figuring out, you know, where can we add value across the whole sort of process.
And why focus on kind of B2B? Why on the enterprise side?
Well, I mean, it was initially born out of the fact that that's where I was selling to already. So in those sales jobs, that's kind of the market I worked in, the sort of trade show business, and learned a lot there from sort of talking to marketers and comms people and brand managers and things like this, the sort of the language that they spoke and the goals they had and the things that mattered to them. And so it was kind of a natural progression for me to move from the physical world of trade shows to, okay, how do you achieve similar sort of goals, but in podcasting and in content marketing. Okay. So that was it really.
Okay. And then in terms of kind of you as a consumer, you touched on it at the start there. What are your maybe top 5 podcasts that you consume today?
Today, I'm probably hugely boring these days. I used to like consume all of the shows, and like I still am a huge podcast listener, obviously, but I was, you know, I had a much broader diet of podcasting, should we say. These days, I'm much more habitual. So I listen to The Rest is Politics all of the time. I'm a big cricket nerd, so I listen to a few cricket podcasts like Tailenders and the Test Match Special podcast, which for international listeners to this show is probably a bit lost. But anyway, cricket fan. And I listen to a bunch of business shows. You know, I used to be a huge fan of My First Million, and I still occasionally listen to that. I listen to the Prof G Markets podcast and things like this. So no interesting podcast recommendations from me these days, I'm afraid. But I listen to, you know, incredible amounts of audio every single day still.
And if you could pick now top 5, you know, podcast episodes that you could host, who would the guest be? And that is dead or alive.
So if I was interviewing anyone on, oh crikey, I don't know. Well, I would love to interview Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell from The Rest is Politics. I think that would be really fun and interesting. So there's some alive people that would be good. I am a music fan, so I'd love to interview some of my sort of musical heroes. I think someone like Aphex Twin would be really interesting because he hates interviews. So that would be like really challenging and potentially really interesting. So someone like that. Yeah, I haven't really thought about it much, but I could probably name some more, but I'll end up just like plucking them out of thin air.
Okay. But quite a kind of wide range of politics, sports, and music would be the
exactly. I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I assuming this invented podcast is just for fun, in which case, that's what I'd like to go for.
Okay. And you touched on before, you know, you being a fan of My First Million. So I know you host MoneyWise, and that was how I originally kind of found you. How did that end up coming about? And just for reference, that is the podcast that you kind of co-host with the guys at Hampton, so Sam Parr, right?
exactly. Yeah. So that came about because I'd actually joined Hampton, and so was inside of that community. And then Sam was looking for help, and at that point, I knew a bunch of people who were close to Sam, and so my company was recommended to him along with a bunch of others, and we got talking and hit it off, and sort of the rest is history. So the rest is history. Get it? That's a podcast reference for you. So definitely being in Hampton was a leg up, but also just the fact that we'd really set our stall out, because I think the reason what Sam was really looking for when he first reached out was kind of narrative-led podcasting, and most of the agencies that you'll find out there are kind of really focused on interview-based podcasting, which there's nothing wrong with, but we're really interested in like storytelling and narrative and making like documentary-style shows, and that was what he was going for. And so that left him with fewer, we were certainly one of the standouts in that kind of crowd, and then being in the community and people knowing me that knew him kind of made it super straightforward. So yeah, it was definitely an advert for networking and joining communities and putting yourself out there, because I think that a lot of the successes that I've had have been the result of the people that I've got to know over the years. Because I started this, as I said, in my bedroom with no network whatsoever, not knowing anybody, and I've made a really concerted effort to get out there and make friends and connections and all that sort of stuff, and it's been a big leg up for sure.
And have you found the best way to do that is kind of like private communities and putting yourself out there online, or?
A combo of all of those things. I think private communities are definitely like an accelerator. You meet a high density of interesting people quickly. The other side of it's been coaching, basically just investing in myself, in oneself. I think is the thing to do. So paying coaches to help level up in specific areas, paying for access to communities that are full of interesting people. But then, I ran my own event when I first got started called Single Track, which was like a mountain bike retreat for a couple of days for entrepreneurs. And I got a group of sort of 10 or 12 people together in Andorra, in the mountains, in the Pyrenees, to ride bikes and talk about business. And that was a huge door opener. Like it was only a small group of 10 people, right? But like those were really 10 interesting people, and those 10 led to lots of other connections. And because I'd made the effort to actually make this thing happen, that really sort of brought some credibility, and people wanted to help and wanted to continue to help introduce me to people and things like this. So cool. Yeah, just investing in that was important, I think.
Okay. And going back to MoneyWise, could you just explain the concept of the show and what that is doing, and I guess related to kind of Hampton specifically? Like, what is the goal of the show?
The intent of the show from the very beginning was really trying to uncover topics that people weren't talking about publicly. So it was about the sort of phrase of it is the people with a high net worth being radically transparent about their finances. And I think most times, or very, very often in most communities, money is kind of a taboo subject. And Sam Parr, came to us with this idea of just like, no one talks about their finances openly. No one tells you how much they're worth, what they spend on a monthly basis, where they invest, how they made their money. They're not open with these subjects, but actually getting insight from people like that is incredibly helpful for someone that's either on their way to wealth and wanting to understand like A, how to get there, but B, how to manage it along the way, and how what they can anticipate for things that they have to deal with and manage and cope with, or just for people that are already there that want to share this experience and get the perspective of other people that are managing that stuff. It's a topic that's really just not covered anywhere.
Sure.
So that's it really. It's interviews with wealthy people, from people with single digit millions of net worth all the way through to billionaires we've had on the show. And they talk about all aspects of finances, but also the impacts that those finances have on their life, on their social lives, on their relationships, their well-being, all sorts of stuff.
Okay. Why is it better to take that kind of approach for the podcast rather than what I assume would be an easier one of just, interviewing founders and asking about their story, in relation to kind of, this as an idea and getting a listenership and interest in Hampton?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the short answer is there's just a million shows of interviewing founders, and it becomes much, much, much harder to stand out and differentiate and grow an audience that way. And so having a real USP helps listeners to understand this is why I should pick this show over any other one. And so if you come to MoneyWise, it's very clear, hey, this is for people that either have money or are on their way to a lot of money. And we're going to talk about problems that only people that are in that position can relate to. And so, if you're a founder, you could listen to all of the different founder interview podcasts, or you could listen to MoneyWise, which is going to give you a very clear bit of value that you're not getting somewhere else. And I think that if you're doing interviews with founders in general, then you're sort of stacking yourself up against the thousands of other shows that have that exact same focus. And that's not to say that interviews with founders can't be a successful podcast, but I do think that you have to have a really clearly thought through and well articulated kind of point of difference to give people a reason as to, like I say, why they should listen to you versus everything else.
And if we kind of zoom out a bit then, so if a business is thinking about maybe starting a podcast, how should they think through that decision? What should they kind of be expecting from it? And how should they approach it?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, it's important to see podcasting for what it is and what it is not. So what podcasting is not, it's not like a fast, viral, hyper growth channel, right? It's not like a TikTok campaign where you could spin it up and you could have one video that gets 10 views and the next video the next day gets 10 million. Like you're not going to explode and go viral overnight with podcasting. It's a much more slow and steady cumulative growth channel. And so it's one that rewards kind of consistency and commitment. So that's what it's not good at, right? Like it's not going to sell you 100 million widgets tomorrow. But what it is really good at is connecting deeply with a specific audience. So building a relationship with a defined crowd of people and having them really, build trust in you, affinity towards your brand. So when we think about things like thought leadership, brand awareness, brand affinity, brand lift, these are the kind of things that podcasting does incredibly well. So, keeping, client success, keeping people around for longer. These are the sorts of things we should be thinking podcasting for. So we shouldn't be saying we're going to spin up a podcast today and we're going to have 20 leads tomorrow. That's a bad use case for podcasting. But we're going to have a podcast today, and in 12 months' time, we're going to have a ton of loyal listeners that are referring friends to us all the time. They're sharing our content across different channels. Sure, we will be getting leads, but that will come later once that audience is well established and all that sort of stuff. So that's the sort of place to start from. Of course, the other side of it is that, having a podcast then gives you this tremendous well of content that you can be using to use across all of your different channels as well. So there's an efficiency piece there as well, which is worth mentioning. But I think a lot of people have that as their sort of primary thought, and they're like, okay, we're going to build an audience and we're going to post this stuff all over social. That's harder to kind of get a ton of value in a short period of time, or even a long period of time. I think it's really important to view it as what it is. Once we've kind of established that and we know why we're doing podcasting, we know what our goals are, what we're trying to achieve from this. The most important thing is to understand the specific audience we're trying to serve. Because if we just go out and say we're going to make a podcast for founders, that's so broad and unspecific. It's going to make it really hard for us to make a show that they're actually going to be interested in, and that's going to, achieve the goals that we're looking for. So we want to be really, really clear with ourselves up front of, firstly, what we're trying to achieve, but who we're trying to serve and why. And so the more specific we can be, and the question I always ask when we're working with people is, so, if you could have just 100 people in the world listen to the show, who would those 100 people be? And if you can articulate that really clearly, then you can then go away and do your research and figure out, what are the podcasts this audience already really loves, and why is that? Where are there opportunities for us to serve this audience that are not already being served? And what's our unique point of view that we can bring to the table to help educate or inform or entertain or whatever that audience particularly needs from us, that no one else is doing. And so I think that those are the questions that we need to think through when we start, is making sure we understand what podcasting is for and why we're doing it. And then really being clear on who we're serving and how we're going to serve them differently. I think most brands, where they go wrong is they go, oh, podcasting is hot. We know we want to start a podcast. It's going to be great because we can share a bunch of content on social media. Great, let's go. We're going to interview these people and put it out there and whatever. And so they're sort of leading from me. They're leading from what's important to me and my brand. And they're putting some content out there, and then they're realizing, oh, actually, this is really hard. No one's really listening. And now we've got to figure out how to promote it and get it in front of them. If instead we take a step back, and before we get started, we have those questions around who we're trying to serve, what they're already listening to, and how we differentiate, that makes the whole rest of the process way, way easier.
Okay, thanks for that, Harry. So I have a bunch of kind of follow-up questions on that. And I think my first one is touching on what you said at the start. Do you view the podcast medium as a kind of middle of funnel tool, if we were to look at it from, kind of that perspective?
It's probably top or middle. I would say it's sort of nearer the top of the funnel, really. It can serve purposes in the middle of the funnel as well, but I think it's more about, affinity is a really fluffy word. It's like the relationship we build with that audience. They really care about us. They trust us as a brand once they're listening on a regular basis. And that's something that's really powerful. It's not something you can kind of like, there's no inherent value to that. There is, of course, but like, there's no, like, you can't put a dollar value or a pound value on someone liking you as a brand, but it just leads to really good things. So that tends to mean that it's sort of higher up the funnel, as that makes sense.
Okay. But it's more kind of brand building versus direct response.
Exactly. If you want direct response, podcasting can also be really great, but then you should be thinking of it as an advertiser rather than a publisher.
Yeah. Okay. And then the next point you touched on was kind of thinking through demographics. My first question here is, would you say that every kind of demographic is reachable on podcasting, or is it, better for certain types of people?
Yeah, no, I think every demographic is listening to podcasts. I would say younger demographics are listening in different ways. They're actually typically watching. They're finding those younger audiences tend to find their content on YouTube and social. So the way that you get your podcast in front of different audiences might vary, but I would say that every audience across the spectrum definitely engages with audio and with podcasting. And the sort of traditional podcast audience probably skews a little bit older, millennials and that sort of thing, because we're the sort of generation that had our iPods and our iPhones when podcasting first became a thing. That's the sort of core audience and one of the really valuable audiences of podcasting, but it's a ubiquitous format at this point, and everyone's listening. So yeah.
Okay. And then you talk to, when someone should be thinking about, starting a podcast, they should definitely go through that research phase that you spoke of. What's next? What happens once someone has kind of answered those key questions?
Yeah. So once you're aware of what your audience cares about and what they need from you, what they're already listening to and their tastes and preferences and all that sort of stuff will inform the creative. You're also going to look at your competitive landscape. You're going to build up a picture of what are you competing with. And that can be, we use tools like Spark Toro to understand our target audiences and look at the sort of media sources and podcasts that they're already listening to build up the beginnings of that competitive landscape. You also want to ask your audience that you're serving, what podcasts do you listen to? Because they're more than just their business tastes. You're also competing for their attention with things like Joe Rogan or their sports podcast or their favorite comedy show. So you want to understand the broad kind of picture of what your audience really cares about from a podcasting perspective. And then the final lens we look things through when we are building out the competitive landscape is the keywords. Like if we're typing into Apple Podcasts, I want to listen to a podcast about AI or robotics or whatever your thing is. We want to know what we're competing with there on the keyword front as well. And so then once you've looked across all of these different sort of ways of splitting up the competitive landscape, you've then got we typically put it in a spreadsheet or something. You've got a big list of shows that you're competing with, and that's going to inform so much. It's going to inform how to think about where their opportunities are, where are there gaps in this landscape that you can kind of do something different and stand apart, or address a topic that's not being addressed. where your unique strengths can be brought to bear, what your unique access to interesting specific topics or people, your unique point of view that is differentiated. But also what you want to look for is the things that are common across all of these different shows. What is the market telling us that it wants? Because clearly there's the most successful shows have all of these things in common. Well, maybe there's elements of those things that we want to incorporate into our show as well, because clearly the market wants that. So we understand our audience, we understand our competitive landscape, and that will inform just a bunch of creative decisions around what show we need to make in order to achieve the things that we want to achieve. And so all of this work takes place before we even book a guest or buy a microphone. And then by the end of that process, we then have a really clear view of like, what's the sort of pitch, the value prop of the show, what's the format, what's the specific way this works. Like most podcasts are interview shows, but there are lots of other formats that we can look at. We talked about MoneyWise, which is more of a sort of narrative driven show. We've worked on podcasts that are like true crime podcasts for brands. We've worked on fictionalized or semi-fictionalized stories, and so there's a bunch of different ways and formats that you can use to deliver value to that audience that you're trying to serve, and any of those different formats are going to help your show stand out immediately from all of the other ones, because they're not going to be just yet another interview show. So and then once you've got your kind of format, then you can start developing the brand of the show, the title of it, the again, the value prop and how you're packaging that and presenting that to the market. And then you can actually think through, okay, what's our content calendar? What do the episodes look like? How do we start to produce that and build that out?
Okay. One point I noticed there, when you talked through the competitive landscape, you said kind of identifying the gaps and thinking about being unique. How important is that to kind of stand out and to build an audience?
I think it's really important. If you were launching a podcast in 2016 and it was an interview show talking to thought leaders in the insert subject here industry, that was enough. That was different because not everyone was doing that then. And certainly if you did that and stuck with it for a couple of years, you're one of the podcasters that are out there right now with a great audience that's long-standing and really successful. These days, every industry, every niche has a podcast for it already, and so you're immediately competing with incumbents. And so really what you've got to do then is think of what you can bring that's unique. Like, again, if you think of it from the perspective of your audience, they open up Apple Podcasts, they go to the category, they're looking for, I don't know, a fintech show, and they type in fintech. They're presented with umpteen options that they could choose to listen to. Why would they pick yours over any others? Like, they're probably going to pick the one that's nearer the top because it's more established, unless you can stand out and clearly signpost like, this is different and this is why this is different and interesting and worth your time. And so I think in all aspects of content, on social, on podcasts, on YouTube, on anything that we could choose to do, there is no shortage of competition, and so we have to do something more, do something better, do something differently in order to be worth the attention of the people we're seeking to serve.
Okay. You also talked about formats and the kind of different types. Obviously, we're doing an interview. You've got your narrative kind of format as well. What other formats can people evaluate? Yeah,
I think there's a real opportunity in news podcasts, for example. Can you be the news source for your industry, be it weekly, daily, whatever? People want to know what's going on in their industry, and if you can be that trusted source, I think that's a really valuable opportunity that just frankly not enough people are doing. We talked about documentary, we talked about true crime. I would love to see, there are no rules here. People aren't exploring areas that I think would be really interesting. If we think about shows that are really successful in other mediums, you've got gear review shows on YouTube, reaction content, but like quizzes. I'm obsessed with this idea that a B2B brand could make a quiz show. I think it would be so fun and like would stand out a mile. And I think if you can find the right angle for your brand, that would be super interesting. You can have chat shows and round tables. If you think about sort of the sports cast kind of format, what's that in B2B? Can you get like a group of 4 people together each week and and have that sort of roundtable chat show type thing where people get to know all the different characters and all that sort of stuff. So I think, I mean, really, I always think through what succeeded before. You know, what was some really amazing formats that worked on radio or on TV, and how do we do that in podcasting? Because what podcasting allows us to do is stuff that was only ever available to, you know, big TV networks back in the day. Well, now, you know, we can buy, you know, a nice Sony camera and set up a studio in our shed like I've got and make something that's pretty good. You know, with a really sort of slimmed down kind of setup. So I think just encouraging people to be a bit more creative and frankly brave, because it can be a bit scary to kind of think, well, everyone else is doing an interview show, so now I'm going to do a quiz show. That's a weird thing to do. Like, am I going to look like an idiot here? Like, so that it takes a bit of bravery to take that leap and do the new thing. But I think the rewards are obvious, because then you immediately stand out. People write about you, they share about you on social, they subscribe and listen every week because they've got a reason to do so. So yeah.
Okay. I saw something pop up on my feed the other day. It was a Waitrose podcast, and it was kind of set in the kitchen. You know, people are eating. How important or how much should people think about different sets and kind of trying different formats there as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, video. So I think up until now we've been talking sort of about podcasting in its traditional sense, and I've mentioned video, but we're sort of thinking about audio. And certainly when we think about really creative formats, audio is where we have a lot more freedom and opportunity to do things that are very different, because, you know, we talked about TV networks. Well, you know, if you want to do something like Waitrose and you're shooting it in a kitchen, suddenly this is getting kind of complex and expensive and location dependent. And there's a lot going on there that makes this more complex. But YouTube is an increasingly important element of podcasting when it comes to discovery. You know, audiences finding your content and the way that audiences are choosing to engage. I think it bears repeating or bears mentioning that, you know, audio still remains the primary channel for podcasting, and most listeners are listeners, not viewers. And so we shouldn't necessarily get too distracted by the video opportunity, because actually if we can do something really wonderful in audio, but it's going to be much harder to achieve in video, well, then I would much rather focus on making something really great in audio and getting all the benefits that audio brings, than stretching too far and kind of basically under-delivering in video. However, if we're a brand that does have the time and the budget and the inclination, well, there is a huge opportunity for being discovered on YouTube. And so then, exactly as an extension of the point we were just talking about, you do then have to figure out how you differentiate and stand out on YouTube. And doing two talking heads on a Zoom call from your boardroom with like a white wall behind you is like not the way to do that. If I click on a podcast interview on YouTube and it's just two talking, I'm bored immediately. There's nothing interesting there at all. And so, you know, the first layer above that, I guess, is getting yourself a nice microphone and a nice video setup. You can then start to invest in the environment you're in. So for me, I've got like nice lighting and, you know, a big armchair that I sit in and all this sort of stuff. So like, you know, leveling up the environment that you're in, to kind of make that a bit better. And then you can just keep going up and up and up. And as you've mentioned, the Waitrose show is an amazing show. It's essentially a TV show, that is a podcast, and available on YouTube and all the rest of it. But I think that, particularly if we're talking about B2B content, so which is obviously a B2C show, but B2B content, again, if our goal is to stand out and earn an audience, then two talking heads on blank backgrounds is just not engaging or interesting. And it's going to be very hard to retain viewers over a period of time, if that's all you're offering them. And so thinking through not just what's our format and our differentiator from a content perspective in audio, but also how do we look the part and stand out and be like worth someone's attention. Also just thinking through like, where does video add to the experience here? You know, because I think if we have just an audio show and two talking heads, like if I watch it versus listen to it, I'm not actually getting a better experience either way. Like you could say, yeah, well, I can see the sort of facial expressions of the speakers and I can kind of get a sense of who they are a little bit more. And sure, some people might have that preference, but there's not really much of a different experience. And so Whereas with the Waitrose example, what you're getting is people cooking food and talking about food, and you can see what's going on. You can see the colors, you can see the way they're preparing the meal. That is a very different experience, and you can still listen to that show and have a great time listening to it. But when you watch it, it's worth your time watching it if you choose to do that, because of these extra elements that you get access to. So I think being really intentional with videos is really important. And if we talk about sort of, when I said in 2016, if you started a podcast interview show, you'd be in a really good place. I think now we're in this position where on YouTube, if you're someone that invests really heavily on making a really well thought through and well executed video show, there is a bit of a moment in time opportunity here. I think it's getting harder every day. So, the best time to start one is today. Yeah. But there's not many people doing it really well, particularly in B2B. So I do think there's an opportunity there to rise to the top fairly quickly if you can think through how you can make that work.
Okay. But there is a lot of kind of different variables, especially if you're starting this from scratch, that you kind of talked about before. So am I correct in saying that your advice to most people is, focus on nailing the other stuff rather than also trying to add on video and getting that right from day one as well?
It's much, much better to make a really well thought through and executed show that's just audio than it is to half-ass a video show. And a video is there's just so many more moving parts.
Yeah.
And now what I just said was talking heads suck, but you've got to have, there's no point in not being on YouTube. So if what you're doing is focusing on making a really great audio experience, great, focus on that, but do still post the talking heads, because you're better off having that than nothing. I'm just saying that if you want to stand out and do well on YouTube, you're going to struggle with that format. But if we're just if we're focusing our efforts on, we've got limited resources and we want to get into podcasting and we want to do the best job we can, go to audio, do publish the talking heads, and that you can work on making that better later. But let's focus on building the audience first. Does that make sense? I feel like I was a bit
complete
waffly
sense
there. Yeah.
The next or kind of follow-up question I have on that is evaluating the different platforms. So obviously you've talked about YouTube there. How do you think through or prioritize some of the other platforms that are more kind of audio focused?
And by that, do you mean sort of Apple and Spotify and things like
Correct,
that? Yeah. Well, I mean, really, there isn't much of a way or a need to prioritize when we're publishing our content via RSS to Apple and Spotify and Pocket Cast and Overcast and Castbox and all these different platforms. Our podcast host is doing those automatically. It's putting it out everywhere already. And so our listeners are going to come from whichever app they use. That's why you hear podcasters all the time saying, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And that means it could be Apple, could be Spotify, could be something else. So there's not too much to consider there. The one thing that we can consider is when we're talking about sort of promoting our show, there are ways to, pitch your content to be featured editorially from Apple or all of these different platforms. They all have teams of people who manage or individuals who manage the stuff that's published to the kind of discover pages. So on Apple, for example, you'll go in and there'll be a bunch of different categories and there'll be featured shows which are editorially curated. There'll be new and noteworthy. There'll be sort of like new categories that get changed all the time. Like they'll have sort of playlists of podcasts that are like, if there's the Olympics on, which for some reason comes to mind, there'll be like sports focused or athletics focused or Olympics focused shows, or when there's something like International Women's Day or Cancer Awareness Week or whatever. There'll be stories related to those different subgenres and topics that will then get curated into these sections on those apps. And so there are ways that you as a podcaster can go and pitch those different platforms to have your content appear. So in that way, there's ways to sort of focus on the different platforms. But otherwise, it's really your content is distributed to all these different places, and your job then becomes, how do I promote this in the wider world? So on social and on our existing channels and all that sort of stuff.
So I want to talk about kind of external promotion in a second, but aside from that kind of, editorial team pitching them, is there anything else you can do on platform to kind of improve your ranking aside from obviously better content?
There are a few things. So I mentioned the sort of editorial side. There's also the paid version of that. So some platforms, Apple not included, Spotify not included, will allow you to buy paid sponsored features in the various sections of the app. So there's a pay to play version of it. And the other piece I suppose to think through is sort of search and discoverability. So we think through SEO as it relates to podcasting. As I mentioned before, when you bring up the app and you're searching for fintech, for example, you want to make sure your show comes up first. And so there's ways in the same way we think about optimizing our blog posts for SEO, we can optimize our podcast for discovery in that way as well. And that part of that is visual, because people will click on stuff that looks good. So you've got to think through that. You've got to think through your titling, because people will click on titles that appeal to them. But then there's also the kind of keyword aspect of it as well, which comes in through the title, through the description and things like this. So those would be the other ways to think about it from a in-channel perspective, or at least the ones we do.
And then in terms of off-channel, then are there any kind of recommendations that you have for a podcast that's fairly new, I would say, so that we can kind of narrow this down?
Yeah. So I mean, one thing that I'm very keen on is PR, sort of traditional PR, and it's particularly in B2B. How can we get industry publications or broader publications, be it digital or physical or whatever, how can we get them talking about our show? Because quite often journalists will do, even in the sort of broadsheets, they'll have segments that are journalists writing, the 10 best podcasts for the I don't know why I'm talking about the Olympics today. It's not topical in the least. But anyway, the 10 best Olympics related cricket. The Ashes is on in Australia. I'll talk about that. 10 best cricket podcasts to listen to this winter. And so that is a really big opportunity. I think a lot of people should focus on it. And then, industry publications, if you're a B2B show, you're in a niche, you're in, I don't know, the plastics or molding industry. Like, how do we get those magazines, those digital publications to talk about our show when it comes out? One of the ways that we can make people want to talk about us from a PR perspective is we need to have a story. Journalists are only going to write about us if they've got a story. Well, we can have a story by firstly doing something unique and different. So if our show is if we've got a quiz show about the plastics and molding industry, well, that's pretty weird. So I think probably someone might write about that. Or you can sort of break a story, interview someone talking about something controversial or new or whatever. So PR, I think, is something that's massively underutilized in B2B and should be done more of. Of course, we have access to paid social, and that's often what marketers will lean towards. Unfortunately, most marketers will lean towards paid social as a sort of a plaster to put over the fact that they've got a normal interview show and it's not performing. And unfortunately, if we have an uninteresting show and people don't want to listen to it, paying to get that in front of people and paying people to listen to it and click on it and whatever is not going to make them like it anymore. It's just going to mean more people are seeing it, which doesn't really achieve the goals that we want to. So I think paid social can work, but it's really something to do once we're 100% confident that our show is literally the best it can be. And the most people listening to this will be like, yeah, Harry, great. Our show's great. We just need more people listening to it. I will say 99.9% of you listening are, I say this with love, you're wrong. It's not as good as it could be. So just take a step back, think to yourself from like we've had clients before, we've said, look, would you listen to this show if it wasn't your own? And most people, if they're being really honest with themselves, it's like, well, no, I probably wouldn't spend my weekends listening to this podcast if I didn't make it. So why should anybody else? And if that's the answer, doesn't mean you're doing a bad job, doesn't mean you suck. It's okay, but it just means let's take a moment, let's take a step back and think through, okay, can we make this show better? Because then once we have and people actually care, and we can see if they're caring, by the way, the metric we should track is not the number of people that are downloading this podcast or clicking play. The number we should track is the consumption rate of that podcast. So how many people are completing episodes? What percentage of our episodes are people listening to? Now, if we can see in our numbers that we're getting 80+%, that's the benchmark that we sort of shoot for. If people are listening to 80+% of our episode, which for a 40-minute episode, that might mean 35 minutes of the episode, right? That means if they're making it through that much of our content, which is, by the way, very common, certainly for us in podcasting, in audio, that means we must be doing something right. We're providing them with some value. They wouldn't listen to 35 minutes of this if they were really bored. And so if we know that if we can look at that number and say, okay, our number started at 40% because we had something that was a bit undifferentiated, a bit uninteresting, unboring, uninteresting, and we've revisited that format. We've now got something that's better, and we can see that number going up. Great. Now's the time we should invest some money into some paid campaigns on social, because we know we've got something right. And if we can target those ads at the right people, then they're going to discover this show and they're going to think that it's great and hopefully stick around and actually be worthwhile. Because otherwise we're just paying Facebook a bunch of money to drive clicks, because they're very good at that. They'll drive clicks to our show. We'll see a spike in downloads, but the consumption rate will be nothing. They'll click play and then they'll just immediately bounce and not care anymore. And they'll never come back, and they'll never remember you. So that's a really long answer to your question. So PR is what we think about, paid social. And then the other stuff is of course just organic social. So putting your content across all the different channels, but being thoughtful about that, not just like using an AI tool to scrape some clips and just chucking them up on social and seeing what sticks. Like actually, thinking through how do we repurpose the content that works well in LinkedIn, for example. So we might say, okay, this conversation with Harry, he's this waffly, specky idiot. He talked about these sort of things. And like, rather than just like having a clip of me, although you might want to use a clip on social, fine. But then there might also be like a 500 word sort of thought piece that you do on LinkedIn. That's really like using that content well. And that like people will read that, they might find that interesting. And they're much more likely then to click through and go, okay, actually, I'm going to listen to this because like I've found some value here already. There must be more in that episode. I think everyone just immediately assumes, oh, we just got to do like a 30-second clip from the podcast. And that, not to say you shouldn't do that. You should do that as well, right? Like, because people consume stuff in different ways. But I think we just got to be a bit more sort of thoughtful around how we do it. And the final thing, and then I'll shut up, I promise, is partnerships. How can we partner with other podcasts to grow our audiences together? So that might mean being a guest on other podcasts, because just to first principles of podcast promotion. If we are on social and we're scrolling through Instagram and there's an ad for a podcast, fine, I see that. It's good for brand awareness, but it's very difficult for me to make the move from I'm just like hitting like on stuff and like spending 5 minutes while I'm, on the toilet thinking about, I'm not like actually going to then go and spend 30 minutes listening to a thoughtful B2B podcast. Really hard to make that journey from one channel to another. So what's much more effective is to say, catch people in channel when they're in podcasting already. They're already listening and consuming long form audio. It's going to be much easier for us to sell them on another piece of content at that moment in time. And so the ways that we can do that is being on other podcasts. So that could be as a guest. We can pitch ourselves to go and speak on other podcasts that serve the same audience as us. We can sponsor those podcasts to get an ad to promote us on our podcast, or we can do something called cross promotion, where we just partner with other shows and we'll say, look, we'll talk about your show, or we might interview you, and then you can talk about our show, and you might interview us on yours. We might even do an episode drop where we'll play an episode of your show on our feed. We get free content for our audiences. You get promotion for you, and vice versa. That's a really powerful one that can actually be incredibly cheap and or free. To basically just find some non-competitive podcasts that serve a similar audience. It's not a zero-sum game. People listen to multiple podcasts a week, and so if you can find those, that's a real unlock as well. So those are the areas that we sort of tend to focus on.
Double tapping on what you mentioned about metrics. So you said completion rate is one of the key ones that you track. What else are you kind of looking at, and how do you judge success?
So one metric that we particularly love at the moment is something called the cost per minute of attention. So as a brand, you want to understand how your content's performing on a investment basis.
Yep.
And we find that if you look at in Apple and Spotify, they will both give you the total number of minutes consumed, right, on those platforms. That obviously won't cover everything, because there's like other apps like, like Overcast and Pocket Cast and stuff where people might be listening. But that typically tends to be like less than 10% of your audience. So most of your audience is on Apple and Spotify and YouTube. And you can look at that, as I say, the total number of minutes listened. If you divide that by the amount of money you've spent to get those minutes of attention, you then have a a cost per minute of attention. You know how much you're spending for that attention. If you compare that to the amount of attention you're getting on social or email or video or anything else, you'll typically find that podcasting performs incredibly well. And so again, it's not like hyper viral. It's not going to get you like huge amounts of reach overnight, but the amount of attention that you get and the amount of, engagement you get for the work and the money that you put in, podcasting is really effective. So that's a metric that I think is really interesting and people particularly in B2B should think about. But easier to measure. Of course, the download is important, right? Like I don't want you to put much weight in it, because the much more important metric is consumption rate. But you do want to vaguely know, how big, how many humans have hit subscribe on our show, because the download number, what it doesn't tell you is the number of people that have listened to the podcast. It tells you how many people have clicked download. They've added it to their app. They may never have hit play. So that number is cool. They hit download, but if they've never heard your content, it doesn't matter. Yep. So it's important to know what that is and track it over time to see if it's going up or down, but it doesn't it's not, don't put too much weight in it. Again, total number of listeners is a number that Apple and Spotify will give you. So you'll know you'll be able to compare the number of downloads you're getting and the number of listens that you're getting. And those two numbers will tell you the number of people that are, again, downloading or subscribing, but they're never actually consuming your content. So when you know the number of listens you've got and the average consumption rate, you're really getting a much clearer idea of like the number of human beings that are actually caring about your content. So that's really where we focus. You can also look at things like ratings and reviews and sentiment towards the show, comments on YouTube and Spotify. Chart positioning is something that often big brands like to sort of shout about because it can be fun to know, hey, we're number 10 in technology. That's cool. But it doesn't really provide much value beyond just a vanity metric, but it is kind of, fun to look at.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. There's a bunch of interesting points here, but what I want to kind of talk about next is, you've talked to here how we get attention, but now I want to kind of pivot to what we do with that attention. And I think my first question is,
sure,
where are you pushing people? So let's say, someone's been listening to a podcast. Is the, CTA to subscribe or to kind of, sign up, or are you pushing people to an email list? What do you recommend there?
There's no one answer. I think if we are in growth mode of the podcast and we're okay without, if we're not in a rush to monetize our content, for want of a better phrase, then really keeping people in channels that is like what I love to do. So subscribe to the show, share it with a friend, share it on social media, write us an email with something you want us to talk about next week. Like, how do we just get people to like care more deeply about the show that they're already listening to, so that we can build and compound that audience as fast as possible, and grow the influence of it. So if we're not immediately in search of results, that's what I would focus on, so that we can just build a bigger, better audience. But then beyond that, then it really does come down to whatever's important to the specific brand. If it's brand awareness, you might just want to talk about the name of the brand a bunch of times, so that people are aware of who you are and what you do, not in a boring salesy way, but in a just a clear communicative way. This podcast is brought to you by XYZ company. We do this, or visit our website. I think podcasting and email play together really well. To your point, I think if you're liking this show, we've also got a newsletter, comes out more frequently, or it covers these topics or whatever. Get that into your inbox, and that means that on the email you've captured their email. That means you know literally who this human being is, because podcasting, you can't tie a listener to a specific human being. There's the data is there's a decent amount of privacy around all that stuff. So by getting them on your email list, you know who your listeners are. But then when you've got them there, you can use the email list to point people back to the show, and you can use the show to point back to the email. And so you can kind of like keep people within the ecosystem and grow both assets at the same time. So I think that's a really good one. I think where podcasting is probably the weakest is like, we've got a special offer on this and that and the next thing, sign up tomorrow. Not to say it won't work and you shouldn't ever do it, but it's just like, it's not the most effective thing. Again, if selling widgets is what you need to do, then being a podcast advertiser may be the better option, because you get immediate reach and scale, and you can be very specific of the people you want to target. That's how we think
So
about CTAs.
it's more kind of soft CTAs of consume more content is what you'd recommend.
I think so. Yeah. And of course, like there's ways to subtly signal or maybe overtly signal, like, this is what we do. If you're this person and you're looking for this kind of thing, let us know. There's no reason you can't do that from time to time. I mean, if we're in B2B, then typically we're selling services that are not like impulse purchases. And so it's hard to meet people that are in market right now in that way. And so I typically prefer to sort of be softer and kind of more suggestive of, it's kind of assumed like we're a company that does this and we're talking about these subjects. And so naturally, if you're that person that's in market for those things, you're going to reach out anyway. So being kind of explicit doesn't necessarily help a huge amount. So it's better to use the podcast to get people like on your email list or taking a sort of a step further down the funnel. We talk about podcasting being kind of high up the funnel. I think that's kind of how to think about it. So just how do we get someone, slightly further down the funnel?
And then when they are ready to buy, they will kind of, take whatever action, they'll naturally do that themselves or, get a prod from a different channel that's not a podcast.
Exactly. And it's the same. It's the same that we think about all content marketing, right? Like there's very few blog posts that the blog post goal is to get you to spend money right in this second. Normally what it is like, cool, here's the blog post and also here's a lead magnet to give us your email. And then we're going to nurture you on email and kind of move you further and further down the funnel. I think podcasting serves really sort of similar role.
Okay. Talking kind of more specifically about monetization, you've mentioned ad spots. What else have you seen the brands that you work with, have great success with in terms of monetizing the podcast?
So if we talk about monetizing the podcast in relation to like literally getting sponsors paying for you to do ads on your show, I would say 99% of B2B shows should just eradicate that thought from their mind. A, because they won't have a big enough audience to monetize effectively because you need sort of scale, and ad rates just are not that compelling. But also you've got the podcast because it's a growth channel for your brand. So why would you give airtime to other brands? It just doesn't really make sense. So I think, monetize, and it's also just like the time it takes to, my hope is if you're a B2B company and you're doing a podcast, you're going to find it much easier to make revenue selling your services than you are going to spinning up this new skill of like selling ads to people on your podcast that's quite small. You might be able to make a few $1,000s a year, or if you've got a really niche and large audience that's hyper valuable and you've got great connections in the industry, then sure, maybe you can make tens or even hundreds of thousands of revenue a year on your podcast. But like, even if you can make, let's say for the sake of argument, 200 grand in sponsorship revenue on your podcast, my hope is that over the course of the year you can make more revenue just doing what it is that you do than that. Like that just seems a huge distraction. So a lot of because we quite often get like brands coming to us going that we want to make this show, and the hope is that long term we'll also be able to monetize that content. Like, okay, sure, maybe if you've got some friends that are happy to sponsor and it's going to be like very little of your effort to kind of plug that in and it doesn't compete or dilute the messaging that you want to get across in your show, sure, great, do that and sort of make it a cost neutral channel for you. But I would say that is a vanishingly small percentage of people that have that opportunity. And so really they should just be thinking about their audience as an audience. Because like, for example, when you're building your email list, no one's thinking like, oh, how do I get sponsors for my email list? No, we've got a newsletter. That's it.
Could I maybe rephrase the question by asking, what are the kind of monetization options for a B2C podcast and which carry over well to the kind of podcasts that you work with and the brands that you align with?
So B2C podcasts, there are, I suppose you could think of monetization in three separate buckets. There's ad revenue, as we've talked about. There's products, how do we sell products directly to this audience? And then the third one is subscription. So how do we get people to sort of become members of our, follow us on, do a Patreon or whatever that looks like. And so those are sort of the three key for B2C. And I would say really the only one that makes sense is the sort of product one for B2B. But again, our product in B2B is typically kind of services. or digital products, or software products and things like this. And again, we then come back to the point of the position in the funnel and what podcasting serves best at. So I typically wouldn't think of any of the, most branded podcasters aren't really thinking about monetization in those ways.
Okay. So it's more kind of build the relationship, and then, you're pushing your own stuff rather than any other kind of monetization angle.
Exactly. I mean, it's just like I said with the newsletter. You've got an email newsletter, you put that out every week. You want people to think that you're clever and smart and know what you're talking about so that they choose to work with you or buy your product in the future. And I think very, very few people have sponsors on those newsletters, even if they've got tens of thousands of subscribers. Very few people are actually, doing Black Friday deals or getting ad sponsors in there. And I would think about podcasting exactly the same way. You just want to build an audience, own that audience, and have that lead to business over the long term.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I want to touch now on kind of relationships, because, podcasting, from what I've found, has been a great way to kind of meet people and build out the network and the knowledge base. The first question I have here is, do you have any tips for staying in touch with past guests and kind of building that relationship further?
I'm not sure that I do specifically. I would say, so yes, I think a podcast is a wonderful way to meet people, and I think it gives you a great basis for a relationship that's different to just like reaching out cold on LinkedIn or something, or email. So I think that's a really good thing. But how to leverage that beyond the interview itself, I think that's down to the individual and your networking skills and style and all the rest of it. I guess it's the same as anything else. If you meet someone at a networking event, how do you stay in touch? I would say similar things. Can we send them a gift afterwards? Thanks for being a guest on the show. This is awesome to have you. I got sent like a bobblehead version of me for being on a podcast once. That was fun. Cool. So you can do gifting if that's your vibe. Mm-hmm. But just staying in touch. And I think sometimes as well, there's opportunity to do sort of like if you have like a guest every week on your podcast, and then at the end of the year you might do like a roundup at the end of the year where you sort of come back to all of your guests and ask them a question about what are your predictions for 2026 or whatever that is. That could be a good way to kind of keep the door open as it relates to the content. But beyond that, it's just you've got to use your networking skills and be a good networker.
Okay. And in terms of doing outreach and getting in front of new people, do you have any tips for that you've seen work well? It's
challenging when you first begin because you've got no audience and no clout, no existing show to point people towards. So at the very beginning, it really comes down to either network or just the ballsiness to approach people that you think you can sell onto the show. I think in the early days, once you're up and running and you've got some guests in the can and the show's out there, I always lean on existing guests. So tell me who else I should speak to. Can you introduce me to one or two people you think would be a great fit for this show? That can be a really good one. And then asking your audience on social if that works for your particular audience. Who do you think we should speak to? Who would you like to hear from on this show? And then, if you get a lot of people saying one specific guest, you can email them and say, look, my audience wants you on this show. You should come on. Things like that. But a lot of it's just hustle, it's the same as the networking thing. You just got to get your head down and do it. For most B2B brands, they've got clients, customers, they've got partners that they can leverage. So for most brands, the initial round of guests can be pretty straightforward because they have those connections already and they have those existing relationships. And so even if they don't have a big audience, those trusting relationships will invest the time to come on the show. I'll also say that in B2B, most people haven't been invited on a podcast yet, believe it or not, even though there's so many podcasts. Everyone's got a podcast. Well, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here, but firstly, I would say the number of podcasts pales in comparison to the millions upon millions of YouTube channels. So we've still got a lot of space to grow here, folks. There's no worries there. But anyway, I come back to my point, which is most people haven't been invited onto a podcast before. Yep. So usually they're thrilled to do that. And so actually you'll probably find that your acceptance rate is pretty high. So I think just cold approaching is perfectly adequate.
Okay. And in terms of the script or coming up with the questions, how do you make sure that you kind of, touch on what you want to touch on, but also include, interesting stuff or whatever the guest wants to talk about as well?
Well, I think you should be careful of what the guest wants to talk about, because often it's themselves or something that they're shilling. And so that's not really particularly interesting to the listener. So I think coming back to what we talked about at the beginning of having a specific point of view and a format and a USP to your show, and letting that drive the narrative of the podcast. We are the podcast that stands for this. And when you know what that this is, that means you know what the question should be, and the theme of the conversations should be, because you're driving at that singular goal. I think I would make a concerted effort to avoid asking the same questions that everybody else asks. I would avoid trying to stand apart by doing something like a lightning quickfire round at the end or something. Like people do that quite often. Just actually differentiating through your point of view and the questions you're asking and all that sort of stuff. The other thing I would do, by the way, is never send your questions ahead of time to the guest, because I've seen examples in the past where people literally write down their answers and just read them off the page, and that's the most unbelievably bland experience you can imagine. So that we want, again, in B2B, this is common. We want to avoid people being canned and prepared. We want them to be natural, human. They want the conversation to flow in a natural way, because that's what's going to be interesting to listen to.
I have had someone do that, by the way. I've sent through a script or question list ahead of time, and they've literally and you can see they've got a separate monitor off the screen and they're just reading it off the side of it.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah.
It's terrible. But look, Harry, that is the end of my kind of question list today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. For businesses that, want to kind of work with you, what do you do? Where can they find you, and who should be getting in touch?
Any brand that wants to make a podcast, we'd love to hear from you. And talk about your plans. As I mentioned, like we want to talk about the strategy of the show, not just how to edit and publish it. And we live at lowerstreet.co. So lowerstreet.co is where you'll find all about us. I hang out on LinkedIn a lot, Harry Morton on LinkedIn, and so you can find me there talking about podcasting all the time. And yeah, I think that should be about it.
Okay, and I'm going to hit you with an Uno reverse and just take one of your tips there. Do you have one or two people that you think would be a good guess to come on this podcast in the future?
I will follow up with me, and I will for sure. I will for sure think about that. So yeah, off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but I'm more than happy to think about it. And if I can find someone that would fit and they're up for it, I'll be sure to do that.
Cool. Okay. Harry, thank you so much for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.